we decided to really look into the news coverage of Israel and Palestine analytically and statistically to really understand what is going on. And we decided to choose clear, objective categories that would be as immune as possible to subjective interpretation. And we decided to look at how deaths were being covered by our media. Now, the important thing is that we looked at how deaths were being covered among both populations. We looked at the first year, then we decided to also look at the coverage for 2004 to see if any patterns we discovered in the first year were then continued in the second year, or whether coverage changed significantly. We specifically studied the New York Times and the three major networks. We looked at ABC, CBS, and NBC, their evening primetime news shows. Now, to do this study, the first job was a very sad job, to discover how many people had been killed during those 2 years, how many Israelis and how many Palestinians. And to learn that fact, we went to an Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, which is very respected and quite careful in its gathering of data. It gathers information for both Israelis and Palestinians. So in looking into how many people had been killed in that first year, we discovered that 165 Israelis had tragically been killed by Palestinians, and that 549 Palestinians had tragically been killed by Israelis. In 2004, what you discover is that 107 Israelis had been killed. For the Palestinian population, however, you discover that the amount of death had greatly increased, that 821 Palestinians had been killed during that period. Therefore, Palestinians were being killed last year by a rate of 8-to-1 over Israeli deaths. Now, keeping those numbers in line, we then looked at what the New York Times had reported and what these major networks had reported. For example, we found that ABC had covered Israeli deaths at a rate 3.1 times greater than Palestinian deaths. We discovered that CBS had covered Israeli deaths at a rate almost 4 times greater, 3.8-to-1. We discovered that NBC covered Israeli deaths at a rate 4 times greater than Palestinian deaths. In other words, just to take one example, CBS, we found that CBS was covering Israeli deaths at a rate of 202%, and they were covering Palestinian deaths at a rate of 54%. Now, of course, the question is, how can they exceed 100% of deaths? Well, what we were really astounded to see is that it was not rare for our media to exceed 100% coverage of Israeli deaths, because we were counting every mention, every report of a death that was being made of either population. And we found that quite frequently there would be follow-up reports about Israeli deaths, so that one death would often be reported on twice. So it's this kind of disparity that we discovered. Now, in 2004, did these patterns get better? You would hope that maybe, our reporters and our editors would improve over time, and we found that was not the case. We found that basically they held the same, and in fact, in a number of cases, the distortion that we found in the first year had grown even greater. We saw that ABC, for example, reported on 157% of Israeli deaths, and at the same time they reported on 39% of Palestinian deaths. In other words, a disparity of 4-to-1. We noticed that with CBS, the ratio of differential between reporting on the two populations was also about 4-to-1. They had reported on Israeli deaths 3.8 times greater. And we found that NBC was actually worse than those two. It had reported Israeli deaths at a rate 4.4 times greater. Now, what's even more troubling is when you look at how children's deaths are being covered. We discovered that in the first year, 28 Israeli children had been tragically killed. And we discovered that 131 Palestinian children had been tragically killed during that first year. Now let's look at 2004, a period of relative calm, as our media were telling us. Well, again, we find a difference. It's very significant. We learned that 2004, 8 Israeli children had been tragically killed by Palestinians, and we learned that 179 Palestinian children had been tragically killed by Israelis. In other words, Palestinian children were being killed last year at a rate 22 times greater than Israeli children. Now here's an example of what the New York Times covered in that first year. We found that the New York Times covered Israeli children's deaths at a rate 6.8 times greater than Palestinian children's deaths. They reported on 125% of Israeli children's deaths, and for that same year they reported on 18% of Palestinian children's deaths. Let's look at what they did in 2004. In 2004, we found that the disparity had grown even greater, and the New York Times reported on Israeli children's deaths at a rate over 7 times greater than they had reported on Palestinian children's deaths. Then you look at the TV networks, and they make the New York Times almost look good. We found that in the first year of covering children's deaths, ABC covered Israeli children's deaths at a rate 13.8 times greater than Palestinian children's deaths. We discovered that CBS covered Israeli deaths at a rate 6.4 times greater than Palestinian children's deaths. We discovered that NBC covered Israeli children's deaths at a rate about 12.5 times greater than Palestinian children's deaths. These are all children. Their deaths are all tragic. Why are we hearing about one population's deaths at a rate up to 13 times greater than we're hearing about another population's deaths? In 2004, we found that again this immense distortion was going on. We discovered that ABC covered Israeli children's deaths at a rate 9 times greater, CBS covered Israeli children's deaths at a rate almost 13 times greater, and NBC covered Israeli children's deaths at a rate approximately 10 times greater. Once again, a huge differential based on ethnicity in the reporting that we're getting from our media. Another way of looking at these deaths is in the following charts, where we show on one side the Israeli column is in blue, and you'll see that the top half of the column is a different shade of blue. Those are the repetitions of deaths that were reported in our media, where that makes the blue column, which is the Israeli death column, look significantly higher than the amount of death that was actually going on the ground. Then you compare that to the red column, the Palestinian column, and you'll notice that the top half, far more than half, I'm afraid, of that column is a vast empty column of Palestinian deaths that were never even reported once, making the Palestinian death column look far smaller than it was in reality. Another very revealing way of looking at these deaths is to chart them chronologically. In the following chart, the first line that you'll see is how the New York Times reported the deaths, the Israeli deaths. Now, in the next line, we'll show you the number of Israeli deaths that had actually occurred during that first year. Now, the next line will show how Palestinian deaths were reported in that first year. And the final line will be the number of Palestinian deaths that actually had occurred during that year. As you'll see, in time after time after time, the curves all follow the Israeli death rate, rather than the Palestinian reported deaths following their own death rate. This is startling to me, and I suspect will be startling to many people.